Better Call Saul gave us cartel kingpins, ruthless enforcers, and a guy who communicates exclusively through a desk bell. But here's the thing. The villain, who arguably does the most damage to Jimmy McGill, doesn't carry a gun, doesn't move product, and doesn't have a single cartel connection. He's a respected lawyer wrapped in a space blanket, and he happens to share Jimmy's last name. Chuck McGill. Better Call Saul's first and arguably most devastating villain isn't a cartel kingpin, a drug lord, or a hitman. It's a guy in a space blanket. Chuck McGill is Jimmy's older brother and a founding partner of Hamlin & McGill, one of the most respected law firms in Albuquerque. He's brilliant, he's principled. He's also the single most destructive force in Jimmy's life, and he does it all while pretending to be the supportive big brother, which is, not ideal. When we first meet Chuck, he's living in a house with no electricity. Phones get left in the mailbox. Visitors ground themselves before entering. He claims to suffer from electromagnetic hypersensitivity, a condition where exposure to electrical devices causes him physical pain. Here's the thing though. There is no medical consensus that this condition is real. Doctors find nothing wrong with him. At one point, Jimmy slips a fully charged cell phone battery into Chuck's pocket, and Chuck doesn't notice for hours. Zero symptoms. Nothing. So what is it really? Chuck is a man so obsessed with control that his mind literally invents a physical condition to justify his withdrawal from the world. He can't accept that he's struggling psychologically because Charles McGill doesn't have weaknesses. The illness isn't about electricity, it's about a man whose need for superiority has started eating him alive. But the real villainy isn't the space blankets. It's what he does to Jimmy behind closed doors. For years, Chuck secretly blocks Jimmy from ever being hired or promoted at HHM. He lets Howard Hamlin take the blame so Chuck can sit back and play the caring brother. I believe in you, Jimmy. Meanwhile, he's the one slamming every door shut. When Jimmy finally discovers that his own brother is the architect of his entire stalled career, it shatters the foundational belief that at least one person in his life supported him unconditionally. The decisive showdown comes in chicanery, one of the greatest episodes of television ever produced. Chuck testifies against Jimmy before a bar committee, and he's technically correct about everything Jimmy did. But Jimmy doesn't fight the facts. He fights the man. He exploits Chuck's psychological vulnerabilities until Chuck snaps and calls Jimmy a chimp with a machine gun. His credibility, the only thing Chuck truly valued, disintegrates in real time. And the worst part? Chuck was right about Jimmy, he just couldn't prove it without destroying himself in the process. That's what makes Chuck so infuriating. His cruelty is wrapped in righteousness. Every terrible thing he does comes packaged with a technically valid justification. He's not wrong that Jimmy cuts corners. But being right doesn't make you good, it just makes you dangerous. Chuck's death comes in the Season 3 finale. After losing his credibility, his firm, and his purpose, Chuck methodically tears apart his own house looking for hidden wires. And then, in the final moments, he kicks over a gas lantern and lets the fire take everything. It doesn't feel like a villain getting what he deserves. It feels like watching someone's untreated mental illness consume them while everyone who could have helped looked away. And Jimmy's reaction? Shockingly cold. He pivots from guilt to reinvention almost immediately, eventually practicing under the name Saul Goodman. Chuck's death doesn't become a lesson. It becomes one more justification for Jimmy's own dissent. If my own brother thought I was garbage, why bother proving him wrong? Chuck McGill is proof that the people closest to you can do more damage than any criminal ever could. But at least Chuck believed he was doing the right thing. The next person on this list didn't even get that courtesy. Howard Hamlin. Howard Hamlin is the villain who was never actually a villain. And that single sentence is exactly why he's one of the most fascinating characters in the entire Breaking Bad universe. When we first meet Howard, he's everything you'd expect from a corporate antagonist. Expensive suits, perfect hair, a smile that looks like it was focus tested by a marketing team. He's the managing partner of HHM, and from Jimmy's perspective, he's the guy standing between him and a real legal career. Every rejection, every polite dismissal, it all comes from Howard. He's the face of no, and for most of the series, that's exactly what viewers believe. Howard is the smug corporate gatekeeper keeping the scrappy underdog down. You watch Jimmy pass the bar on his own, build something from nothing, and there's Howard telling him it's not enough. The show wants you to hate him, but here's the thing, it's a lie. Every career-blocking decision Jimmy attributes to Howard actually traces back to Chuck. Howard isn't the architect of Jimmy's rejection, he's the messenger. Chuck, Jimmy's own brother, secretly insists that Jimmy never be elevated beyond a subordinate role at HHM. Howard is just bound by partnership loyalty, carrying out orders while absorbing all the resentment himself. His antagonism isn't personal, it's performative duty. Once you understand that, Howard's entire character shifts. He never orders violence, he never participates in drug trafficking, he never knowingly destroys an innocent life. His worst actions are professional decisions that fall well within reasonable corporate practice. Is he occasionally arrogant? Sure, but arrogance isn't villainy. Being a little smug at work isn't a crime. Howard is a product of narrative framing, pure and simple. The show films everything from Jimmy and Kim's perspective, and because they resent him, we resent him. The writers deliberately constructed a character whose surface reads as obstacle, while his substance reads as decent human being doing his job. Most viewers don't even realize it's happening until it's too late. Which brings us to plan and execution. The mid-season finale of Season 6 contained one of the most shocking moments in the entire franchise. By this point, Jimmy and Kim have spent weeks executing an elaborate con to systematically destroy Howard's professional reputation, staged evidence of drug abuse, manufactured incidents of mental instability, the works. They dismantle this man's credibility piece by piece, and they do it for fun. Not survival, not self-defense. Fun. Howard, realizing he's been played, shows up at their apartment to confront them. He's raw, he's furious, and for the first time in the series, he's completely right about everything. He tells them exactly what they are, and then Lalo Salamanca walks in and shoots him in the head. No warning, no build-up, no dramatic standoff. Howard Hamlin, a man whose greatest sin was being a little too corporate, dies as collateral damage in a cartel conflict he never chose to be part of. Wrong apartment, wrong time. That was it. His death retroactively reframes the entire series. The question isn't whether Howard was a villain, the question is whether Jimmy and Kim were. They spent weeks destroying a fundamentally decent person's life for sport, and the universe punished that cruelty in the most brutal way possible, not by hurting them directly, but by killing the man they'd already broken. The fan reevaluation was massive. People who'd spent 5 seasons rolling their eyes at Howard were suddenly grieving him. And that grief carried a specific kind of guilt, because the show had tricked them into disliking someone who never deserved it. Howard Hamlin wasn't the villain of Better Call Saul. He was the victim. The audience just couldn't see it until a bullet made it obvious. But if Howard's story makes you rethink who the real villains are, wait until you hear about the character who was trapped between every single one of them. Nacho Varga. Calling. Nacho Varga a villain is like calling a mouse in a glue trap an intruder. Technically accurate, completely missing the point. Nacho first shows up in the episode Mijio as a quiet, calculating member of the Salamanca crew, and right away, you can tell something's different about him. He's not like Tuco, who treats violence like a hobby. He's not like Hector, who sees people as either tools or problems. Nacho is smart enough to see exactly what kind of world he's in, and exactly how little that world cares about him. He questions Tuco, he pushes back on Hector. And in a world where questioning your boss gets you buried in the desert, that takes a very specific kind of quiet courage. But here's where it gets complicated, because Nacho doesn't just resist passively, he commits attempted murder. When Hector Salamanca decides he's going to use Nacho's father Manuel's upholstery shop as a front for drug operations, Nacho does what any loving son trapped in an impossible situation would do. He swaps out Hector's heart medication for fakes. The plan is simple. Hector takes his pills, the pills do nothing, Hector's heart gives out, and Manuel never has to look over his shoulder again. It's protective and murderous at the same time. An act of love wrapped in premeditated homicide, which is, not ideal. The plan partially works. Hector survives but ends up wheelchair bound, communicating through nothing but a bell and a death stare. So Nacho technically wins. Except he doesn't. Because Gus Fring figures out what Nacho did, and instead of turning him in, Gus does something worse. He blackmails Nacho into becoming an informant against the Salamancas. Nacho goes from trying to save his dad to being a puppet with 2 sets of strings. Neither side cares about him. Both sides will kill him the moment he stops being useful, and that's the tragedy of Nacho Varga. Every decision he makes is driven by one thing: protecting his father. Every terrible choice, every dangerous alliance, every sleepless night traces back to Manuel, a good man who runs an honest business and has zero idea how close he is to being swallowed by the cartel. Nacho carries that weight alone, and it crushes him slowly across 6 seasons. His final episode, Rock and Hard Place, is one of the most gut-wrenching moments in the entire Breaking Bad universe. Facing imminent capture and knowing the cartel will torture him for information, Nacho does the only thing he has left. He negotiates, not for his own life, for his father's safety. He secures terms that will keep Manuel untouched, then walks into a meeting with cartel leadership and tells them exactly what he did. He owns it. He looks them in the eye and refuses to be their victim, then he takes his own life. Not because he gave up, because it was the last move on the board that he controlled. The cartel wanted to execute him slowly, make an example of him. Nacho denied them that. His death wasn't surrender, it was the most aggressive act of defiance in the entire show. He chose when, he chose how, and he chose why. And the why was always his dad. Here's the thing about Nacho. He attempts to kill a man. He participates in drug trafficking, By any legal standard, he's a criminal. But his violence is never about power or money. It's about trying to prevent something worse from happening to someone who doesn't deserve any of this. He's not Jimmy's antagonist in any traditional sense. He's Jimmy's warning. A living demonstration of what happens when someone smart and cautious gets tangled up with people who have no bottom. You can be careful. You can be clever. And the machine will still eat you alive. The fact that his final act is one of the most heroic moments in the entire franchise tells you everything about how complicated villain really is, as a word. But if Nacho's story makes you feel something, wait until we talk about the man who started all of it. The patriarch whose cruelty set every single one of these dominoes falling, Hector Salamanca. Every other villain on this list has layers. They've got justifications, internal conflicts, moments where you almost understand why they do what they do. Hector Salamanca has none of that. Zero. He is pure, distilled cartel brutality poured into a human body, and honestly, that simplicity is what makes him one of the most effective villains in the entire franchise. In Better Call Saul, we get to see Hector before the wheelchair, before the bell. And somehow, he's even worse when he can walk and talk. This is a man who looks at Nacho's father, Manuel Varga, an honest upholstery shop owner who wants absolutely nothing to do with the drug trade, and says, "You're going to let me run product through your business, and if you don't, bad things happen to your family." Not in those exact words, obviously, more like, "Nice son you got there. Be a shame if something happened to him." Classic cartel poetry, and that's the thing about Hector. He doesn't negotiate, he doesn't strategize, he doesn't play chess. He walks into a room, makes it very clear that he will hurt everyone you love, and then waits for you to comply. His entire philosophy of power boils down to one sentence: be scarier than the other guy. No corporate structure, no public image, no charity dinners, just fear. But here's where Hector's story takes one of the most fascinating turns in television history. Nacho, desperate to protect his father from this animal, secretly swaps out Hector's heart medication for fakes. The plan works, sort of. Hector doesn't die, but he suffers a catastrophic stroke that leaves him wheelchair-bound, unable to speak, unable to move on his own. The most physically imposing villain in the show is reduced to a man who can communicate through exactly one method, a desk bell. And not just any bell. This thing originally belonged to the Hotel Tulipan, which is a detail that sounds like nothing until you realize this tiny brass bell becomes one of the most iconic props in television history. It's up there with Walter White's hat, with the Los Pollos Hermanos logo. One little ding, and you immediately know exactly who's behind it and exactly how angry he is. Here's what's genuinely unsettling about post-stroke Hector. His body is destroyed. He can't walk, can't talk, can't feed himself. By every conventional measure, he should be neutralized, completely defanged. But he's not. He somehow condenses his entire personality, decades of cartel violence and simmering hatred, into two things: his eyes and that bell. The death stare he gives people from that wheelchair carries more menace than most villains generate with a loaded weapon, which is, not ideal for anyone standing near him. And the hatred driving those stares has a very specific target: Gustavo Fring. The roots of the Salamanca-Fring conflict stretch across both series, and Hector's burning contempt for Gus is the engine that powers some of the most consequential events in Breaking Bad. Every single ring of that bell is basically Hector screaming, "I will find a way to destroy you," at a man who took everything from his family. The fact that he eventually does find a way, well, that's Breaking Bad territory. But Better Call Saul lays every piece of groundwork for that moment, showing us exactly why Hector would rather die than let Gus win. What makes Hector interesting as a villain isn't complexity. It's the total absence of it. He's the baseline, the measuring stick. Every other antagonist in this show, Chuck with his intellectual cruelty, Gus with his corporate precision, Lalo with his charisma, they're all defined partly by how they differ from what Hector represents. He's the raw, ugly foundation that the cartel is built on. No charm, no sophistication, just a man who believes that if people aren't afraid of you, you're already dead. The fact that an 80-year-old man in a wheelchair ringing a desk bell can make your blood run cold is maybe the single best testament to how well this character was constructed. Most villains need monologues. Hector needs one finger and a piece of brass. But if Hector is the snarling, unpolished face of cartel evil, then the man sitting across from him is something far more dangerous, because Gus Fring does everything Hector does, except he does it with a smile, a clean apron, and a publicly traded chicken restaurant. Gus Fring. Here's something most people don't realize. Gus Fring has appeared in more episodes of Better Call Saul than he did in Breaking Bad. The character most people associate entirely with Walter White's story actually has more screen time in the prequel. And honestly, that makes sense because Better Call Saul doesn't just use Gus. It explains him. It shows you exactly how a man builds a drug empire while simultaneously winning community service awards and obsessing over the cleanliness of a chicken restaurant. And that contrast is the entire point. Gus Fring is what happens when corporate professionalism and ruthless evil stop being opposites and start being the same skill set. The discipline it takes to run a spotless fast food franchise is the exact same discipline it takes to build an underground meth superlab without anyone noticing. Los Pollos. Hermanos isn't a cover for the drug operation, it is the drug operation. The charity work, the community relationships, the public image of a disciplined immigrant success story, all of it functions as both genuine business practice and an airtight laundering machine. Gus doesn't wear a mask. He just has two faces and both of them are real. But here's where it gets genuinely unsettling. Gus's cruelest act in Better Call Saul isn't a murder. It's what he does to Nacho Varga. After discovering that Nacho tampered with Hector's medication to try to kill him, Gus doesn't expose Nacho. He doesn't punish him. He does something far worse. He blackmails him into becoming a coerced informant, feeding intelligence about every Salamanca operation. And the leverage isn't just the threat of exposure. It's the threat of what happens to Nacho's father if the cartel finds out. Gus identifies the one thing Nacho cares about more than his own survival. His father Manuel, an honest upholstery shop owner who wants nothing to do with the cartel, and he weaponizes that love into total obedience. Every task Nacho performs from that point forward is performed under the understanding that refusal means his dad dies. Not quickly, not cleanly, the cartel way. That's not intimidation. Hector does intimidation. Hector slams his fist on tables with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Gus does something more sophisticated. He creates a situation where you enslave yourself, where your own love for your family becomes the mechanism of your control. Nacho can't even hate Gus properly because Gus never raises his voice. He just states facts and lets the implications do the work, which is, not ideal. And this is Gus's entire operational philosophy. He doesn't destroy enemies head on. He orchestrates. His long-term goal throughout Better Call Saul is dismantling the Salamanca family's influence and positioning himself as the primary conduit to the Mexican suppliers. But he never declares war. He exploits Hector's incapacitation after the stroke. He fills power vacuums so quietly that by the time anyone notices, it's already done. Every casualty looks like someone else's fault. The man sees people as tools. That's the whole worldview. Nacho is a useful asset until he isn't. Mike is a reliable operator until he becomes inconvenient. They're all components in a machine, and Gus maintains that machine with the same detached precision he brings to quality checking a batch of fried chicken. There's no anger in it, no sadism, just efficiency. And somehow that's worse than every screaming cartel psychopath in the show combined. What makes Gus particularly insidious is that his villainy bleeds into Jimmy's world structurally. His willingness to manipulate legal institutions contributes to the slow erosion of the boundary between Jimmy's practice and the criminal underground. He doesn't need to threaten Jimmy directly. He just needs to exist, operating in a way that makes the line between legitimate and illegitimate work increasingly invisible. The genius of expanding Gus across Better Call Saul is that you watch the architecture take shape. In Breaking Bad, he's the finished product, the perfectly composed kingpin who dies with half a face. In Better Call Saul, you see him laying every brick, recruiting assets, building the lab, cultivating his public image with the patience of someone playing a game measured in decades, not weeks. And the scariest part? He's good at it. Not just competent, genuinely, terrifyingly excellent at every single aspect. The chicken's actually good. The community work is actually helpful. The drug empire is actually efficient. Gus Fring is the villain who makes you realize the most dangerous people in the world aren't the ones who seem dangerous. They're the ones who seem like pillars of the community. But if Gus is the chess player, methodically positioning pieces across years of careful strategy, then the next villain is the guy who flips the entire board over, grins, and asks what's for dinner. Lalo Salamanca. Merisig Odrex. Every villain on this list operates from a place of pressure. Chuck is suffocating under resentment. Howard is drowning in obligation. Nacho is scrambling to survive. Hector is consumed by rage. Gus is buried under decades of calculated revenge. And then there's Lalo Salamanca, who walks into every room like he's about to have the best night of his life. That's what makes him the scariest person in the entire show. Lalo is the last major villain introduced in Better Call Saul, first appearing in Season 4. Nacho walks into a restaurant and finds Lalo calmly cooking in the kitchen. Just a guy making food, smiling, relaxed. And Nacho, a man who has stared down Tuco, manipulated Hector, and worked as a double agent for Gus Fring, is immediately terrified. Not because Lalo threatens him, because Lalo is a Salamanca, and he's comfortable. That combination has never meant anything good for anyone. Here's the thing about Lalo that separates him from every other antagonist in this show. He's having fun, genuinely enjoying himself. Hector rules through fear. Gus rules through control. Lalo rules through the sheer unsettling reality that he treats life-threatening situations like a game he's already winning. He smiles when things go wrong, he improvises under pressure, like a man who has never once doubted he'll figure it out, and the worst part is, he's usually right. You can plan around someone who's purely calculating. You can outmuscle someone who's purely physical. You cannot prepare for someone who is both, and also thinks the whole thing is hilarious. But Lalo's most devastating moment has nothing to do with cartel warfare. It has everything to do with a lawyer named Howard Hamlin. In the Season 6 mid-season finale, Lalo arrives at Jimmy and Kim's apartment to interrogate them about Gus's secret meth lab, and then Howard Hamlin walks through the door. He's just figured out that Jimmy and Kim have been running an elaborate con to destroy his reputation, and he's furious. He bursts in to confront them, delivering a raw, emotional speech about what they've done to his life. For a moment, the scene belongs entirely to the legal drama. This is the courtroom world. This is the safe storyline. Lalo looks at Howard, assesses him in about 2 seconds, and shoots him in the head. No warning, no hesitation. Howard Hamlin, a man who spent 6 seasons navigating professional politics and personal insecurities, drops dead because he walked into the wrong room at the wrong time. Which is, not ideal. This is the moment where Better Call Saul's 2 worlds violently collide. Jimmy and Kim convinced themselves the legal con and the cartel conflict would never intersect. They thought they could play games with Howard's career while tiptoeing around cartel business. Lalo proved them wrong in the most permanent way possible, and he didn't even care. Howard's death meant nothing to him, a complication resolved in under 3 seconds. Fan discourse consistently labels Lalo the best villain in Better Call Saul, and the reasons are paradoxical. People are terrified of him and fascinated by him in equal measure. One widely shared fan commentary captures it perfectly. The writer admits Lalo genuinely terrifies them, but then describes admiring him as one might admire a truly dangerous thing that should never be let loose in the world. That's the Lalo experience in a sentence. You know he's a monster. You cannot stop watching him. Fans draw comparisons to Hannibal Lecter and the Joker, and those comparisons land because they identify the same phenomenon. Characters whose evil is completely inseparable from their entertainment value. Every second he's on screen, you're locked in, because he could do literally anything, and he'd do it with a smile. But beyond the villain rankings, Lalo represents something specific for Jimmy McGill's story. He's the final, undeniable proof that the world Jimmy chose to play in has real, irreversible consequences. Chuck warned him. Howard confronted him. Nacho showed him what entanglement looks like from the inside. But Lalo is the one who put a body on Jimmy's floor and forced him to help cover it up. After Lalo, there's no going back. There's no pretending the legal world and the criminal world are separate. There's no more Slippin' Jimmy, the charming con artist whose schemes only bruise egos. There's only Saul Goodman, a man who watched an innocent person die in his living room and kept going anyway. Lalo didn't create Saul Goodman, but he killed the last version of Jimmy McGill that could have walked away, and he probably smiled while doing it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.